now we'll be moving to our next speaker, James Olcese. Please welcome. Dr. Olcese is a Professor Emeritus at Florida State University College of Medicine and a leading authority on the neuroendocrine system and the circadian clock. His work is focused on the onset of labor and the role of melatonin receptors that they play in triggering and sustaining labor contractions. Dr. Olcese has received many Innovator Awards from Florida State University for his biomedical research, which has resulted in 3 patents. Dr. Olcese believes that research should serve not only to advance our knowledge of the world, but also provide insights and technologies to help humanity live healthy and meaningful lives. Please welcome Dr. Olcese.
Thank you so much for the introduction.
My pleasure.
Before I start, I wanted to address my thoughts about, well, how did I end up here today? Before I came, I thought, how does what I do fit in? I mean, you're designers and artists and light engineers and architects, and it hit me just an hour or so ago. I think I know what was in Doreen's mind when she called me, or we Zoomed, I guess it was, right, about a year ago. And I guess if I had to put it in keywords, I'm guessing what you found in my work was reproduction, light, and not the 3 dimensions of space, but time. And that kind of covers what I do, or at least what I'll be talking about today. And I hope I can explain that as we go. So I am a Professor Emeritus. I retired about 18 months ago from Florida State University College of Medicine. And the work that I'll be describing here has been my fascination for over 20 years. Before I even went to Florida State, I was in an institute for hormone and fertility research in Hamburg, Germany for 15 years. And it was kind of there where my epiphany happened. Up until then, I would have called myself more of a physiological ecologist. I was interested in seasonal rhythmicity in animals, the role of our circadian clocks, which, if you know the field, that was really starting to take off in the 80s and 90s. And it just really grabbed my attention. So I went full hog into that. But because I was in Hamburg at an institute that was associated with the OBGYN clinic at the University Hospital, I started coming more and more into contact with really interesting phenomena in the field of human reproduction. And one of those that we've heard a lot about here is, of course, the issue of labor, when the baby is preparing to begin its life. Now, we know in the last 30 years there's been innumerable studies demonstrating that the timing of birth, of labor and birth in the human, and in fact in most animals, is driven by a special part of the brain, at least in animals that have a brain, and this is the circadian clock. I'll get into the detail there in a moment. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows what melatonin is. I was in Germany just as it kind of hit the market, and I remember being interviewed by German newspapers, German television, radio. Tell me about melatonin. What is this stuff, you know? At the time, it was already on the market in the US for sleep. Hadn't yet become legal in Germany, but people were ordering it through international drugstores. So it was really hot. it turns out that melatonin is really not that good for sleep. If you've ever tried it, it does make you sleepy, but it's not a great sleep-inducing hormone. It's really an output signal of our clock. And what it does is it feeds back, as a hormone does, onto the clock to tell that structure, and in fact all organs of the body, that it's nighttime. So it's a signal of nighttime. In fact, a friend of mine who was early in the field, he's 90 years old now, he used to call melatonin the hormone of darkness, which I thought was a little flaky, but okay. Well, light, as everyone knows, can impact our clocks, as demonstrated by the effect of light on sleep. I've just gotten through my jet lag from flying over yesterday because I've got some tricks up my sleeve, how to do that, and it involves light. So I'm telling you this as a sort of a prelude to what I'm going to show you. The key to this work that I'll be describing today is that connection between labor, melatonin, and the clock. And so we were the first to demonstrate about 20 years ago now that the receptors, the proteins necessary to transduce the melatonin hormone's signal of nighttime to a response in any tissue, we were the initial discoverers of the melatonin receptors in the uterus of the woman. This was ignored. No one seemed to see any point in it, Who cares? It's in every tissue. Well, that's not true, but people just basically sort of, okay, cool. But we went on to study the actual mechanisms after binding within the cells of the uterus, the actual signaling pathways, the gene responses, everything else. And it's a really interesting story. If I had 3 hours, I'd go through it all, but I don't. Let's just leave it at the statement here that melatonin promotes uterine contractions in the woman. Now, this is a point in the early work we did that always threw me, because there had been studies in rats which showed just the opposite. I thought, now wait a minute, with mammals, it should be the same. But then it dawned on me, no pun intended, that melatonin as an output signal of the clock is telling the rat that it's nighttime. It's telling the human that it's nighttime. Well, what does that matter to a rat? Well, a rat, pregnant rat giving birth to the pups, is going to deliver babies during the daytime, because that's when the rat retreats into its burrow, to its den, and delivers the pups. Melatonin tells the rat that it's daytime. Of course, light outside will do the same thing. And so they stay in their burrows. The human, in the early primordial era, would give birth primarily at night. And melatonin is a key, a signal for night. So to make a long story short, with this understanding of why there is this difference, and believe me, I had a lot of papers rejected because they'd say the literature shows it does the opposite. But that was in rats. Okay, guys, we're talking about humans here, right? Didn't matter. The idea that light affects the clock has been known for a long time. Many of us here are old enough to recall the breakthrough studies of Tom Ware at NIH in the 70s, showing that light inhibits melatonin and can be used to treat certain disorders of clock function like seasonal affective disorder. The phototherapy lamp, that all came about from the understanding of clock function. Well, we wanted to test the idea that light may have an effect on uterine contractions. So this is where we're going. This graph shows a depiction of thousands upon thousands of studies in the literature showing when spontaneous, normal labor beginning in the human, pregnant human. And as you see, it's a very strong rhythmic pattern I think everyone knows this here. When I first started getting into this area, since I'm not a clinician, I had to learn a lot of things about how clinics work. I went to the OBGYN with this. They said, we know this. Everyone knows babies are largely coming at nighttime. That's why we induce them so they can come in the daytime. Okay, well, that still didn't help me because I wanted to know, well, why is this happening in such a dramatic fashion at nighttime? Well, I've kind of set the stage already with my reasoning with the rat and the human differences. Well, again, to go back to that point, the timing of birth, presumably in the millions of years of human evolution, had a clear selective advantage because the women who did retreat to their home camp, whether it was a cave or a hut or whatever, having their mates and partners and friends around, protected from the weather, having less stress and so forth there, were probably more likely to be successful at bringing babies to the world than being out in the fields harvesting when a lion comes along, right? So it seems like that's a clear selective advantage to having babies at night, which would, in my mind, ecologically speaking, explain this rhythm, why it's evolved. But it doesn't tell me how it works. Well, this is where melatonin comes in. Everyone, I think, here would know that melatonin is a rhythmic hormone, shown on the lower left there. This is a trace showing plasma levels of melatonin in a single human being, kept in a dim light environment without any light cues. You see a clear rise during the dashed phase. That's the nighttime with the black bar on the bottom. That's the nighttime, the typical time when melatonin rises, and then it drops back for the early morning hours. Even though there's no light cues here, it's driven by the clock. Right? The clock knows it's night or day by the virtue of being a clock. That happens the second night the same way. And then you see on the third night, they exposed, this is from Tom Ware's early work, he exposed the subjects to a bright light using these phototherapy lamps. And look what's happened. The melatonin drops rapidly and significantly. So this was the first indication that the clock drives melatonin, and via light, as you see in the schematic on the right there, light, dark, through the eyes, via the suprachiasmatic nucleus is a hypothalamic structure, a few tens of thousands of neurons that connect through the spinal cord to the pineal gland, which is shown by the little arrow in that x-ray there. And this is the site of the rhythmic melatonin that we see in the blood. An interesting aside, I remember another one of those paradoxes like the rat-human thing. There was a lot of controversy early on. Can we use that melatonin as an output of clock function in blind people? Blind people often have a lot of challenges, not only because they can't see, but because their clock is not able to take light in and set their phase so they're awake when we're awake and asleep when we're asleep, right? They start to drift out of phase because their clocks aren't exactly 24 hours, and they end up being awake during our nighttime and asleep during our daytime when they have to go to work, which is hard enough anyway, being blind, and so on and so on. Well, it turns out about a third of the blind population don't have free-running clocks. Their clocks synchronize. And there was a lot of confusion. Well, how can that be? How does light get to the clock to synchronize function in blind people? Well, it turns out, and this is, again, another 3-hour lecture, excuse me, turns out the retina, the area of our eyes that captures light, has the classical rods and cones that everyone knows about. But in the 90s, another category of photoreceptors was discovered. It's called intrinsically photoreceptive retinal ganglion cells. They're neurons. They're not photoreceptors. But they are able to capture certain wavelengths of light. And in blind people who've lost the ability to visually see objects, those cells are still capturing light. And so they are able to synchronize their clocks. Again, it's a small population of otherwise blind people. Again, that's an aside, pardon me. Okay, so now we're getting into some of the data here. I wanted to explore, does melatonin, since it's in the blood high at night, does that correlate to the contractions of the late-term pregnant woman's uterus, which, as you know, in the final week starts to rise and rise every night and comes back down. Well, how do we study this? You know, I can't put a tachometer on a pregnant woman's belly and start injecting melatonin. That's not allowed. I wouldn't want to do it anyway. So we had to start with some in vitro work, sorry. And this is kind of ironic because the person who developed this assay was from Toronto, Han Singh, and he developed a collagen disc, which in the paper he calls a puck, obviously. We call it a disc, and you can see in these images to the left, these collagen discs are floating in culture medium, and on top of the discs, you can't see at this magnitude, are the cells that we seeded from human donors. Okay, we had access to tissues which then were immortalized, so they would continue dividing and providing a source of human myometrial, that is muscle, smooth muscle cells, which we seeded on these pucks. And using his technology, we could then explore contractions. If the agent applied into the dish promotes contractions, then the disc will shrink because the cells contract and they pull the disc with it, right? And you can set up a dose-response curve and measure that and quantify it and all this. Again, I don't have the time to go into all the details, but you can see that the control at the top is much larger. This is the same scale as the treated below, which has shrunk down, right? Now, there is a limit. You can't do a whole lot. You can't do 3 magnitudes of contraction on this basis, but enough to see at least if things are working. And on the graph to the right, you can see that based on the degree of the puck size in the untreated controls, when we add iodinated melatonin, that's just a stable form of melatonin, binds the receptors just like normal melatonin. You can see with the asterisks there that we get a small but significant contraction. We can block this by using a specific melatonin blocker, receptor antagonist, the 4-pp dot, and we're back down to that red line, which is the control. Okay, so that was our first insight into, well, maybe this is something. Yeah, this seems to be working. We then took the rather audacious step, since this assay was developed by Xing to study oxytocin, which of course everyone knows promotes contractions. We thought, well, let's do the two together. Because in late-term pregnancy, clearly oxytocin levels are rising. The receptors are appearing after being quiescent for most of pregnancy. We found the exact same phenomenon with melatonin receptors, interestingly. Through most of pregnancy, there were no receptors. At the end of pregnancy, as labor was beginning, voila, the receptors appeared. And shown here, you can see the oxytocin OT in the dark bars, a nice dose response up to the maximum possible in this assay. When we added 1 nanomolar melatonin, which is the equivalent dose in circulation, you can see in the light gray bars that even at the lowest oxytocin level on the left, 0.1 nanomolar, which by itself doesn't do a hell of a lot. But when we add the melatonin to it, we're practically at maximum. So we've potentiated, we've enhanced oxytocin effects on contractions by adding melatonin. We can block that on the right. You can see melatonin alone, a small effect, oxytocin, a bigger effect, the two together, even larger. And when we block the melatonin receptors again, specifically, we're back to oxytocin alone. So this, to us, meant that there's an interaction between the two receptors. Our subsequent work showing all the signaling details confirmed that. They follow almost exactly the same signaling pathway through the cell, leading to contractions. This just summarizes in a schematic form what we now see as, I don't know how that white reference in the middle there ended up, shows in the daytime when the late term uterus is more or less relaxed. You have uterotonin such as oxytocin and melatonin at low levels. To the right, you get somewhat higher levels of uterotonins, but a huge rise in melatonin. You know, the difference between day and night, melatonin is like tenfold in many women. And that we predict should lead to the contractile state, which is highest at nighttime. So that's our working model. This is just a summary of what I've tried to impress upon you. I don't need to read it. The bottom line is we would like to argue that melatonin serves as a circadian signal from the clock, which gates, that is to say, allows for labor-inducing mechanisms to occur primarily at nighttime when melatonin is there. Okay? Well, when I presented this years ago, I had people saying, well, who cares? You know, what can you do with that? Well, we know that preterm labor also shows nocturnal rhythms. Even in weeks 24, you see a rise in the contractions. And when we looked more into the literature, we recognized that even though this is a big problem in the world, about 10% of all spontaneous preterm labor that is not due to trauma, infection, other sort of things, has not changed. It's been pretty constant in most cultures for decades now, despite a lot of pharmacological approaches to try and deal with it, from calcium channel antagonists, beta blockers, tocolytics of various sorts. They work to some degree for a day or two, but they often have numerous side effects, and the World Health Organization, the ACOG, and others don't recommend it for longer-term treatment of preterm labor. So this, again, I tend to be a little audacious at times, and I thought, well, go for it, you know. Well, can it hurt to suggest that there might be a way to treat preterm labor in a non-pharmacological manner? This is just a global depiction of the levels of preterm in 2020 from a paper that just came out. Well, going back to our hypothesis with the melatonin and contractions shown here, nocturnal labor is a circadian event, and we argue it is mediated maybe not entirely, but to a large extent by the clock via the output signal melatonin. We believe the same thing is true for preterm labor, because many, not all, but many of the mechanisms behind spontaneous preterm labor, apart from trauma and infections and so forth, are thought to be very similar. So we would propose that if melatonin is behind these contractions at night, in the person now, not in a dish, in a person, then why don't we try something? And this is where I went to the OBGYNs in the hospital and said, I'd like to do an experiment with late-term pregnant women who are contracting, and I want to shine a light in their eyes for an hour and see what happens. And they said, are you crazy or what? Why? What does this support? You know, it took me 2 years to finally get IRB approval, and we ended up getting 20 volunteers. We actually had more, but as you can imagine, when you sign up women to do a study like this a month or so before you want them in the clinic, some of them have their babies, and so they drop out. So it was a challenge. That's why it took us a while. But this is our hypothesis, that if we can reduce melatonin in the classical manner, as I showed you before, using light, and that's the phototherapy lamp on the top right corner, then we ought to see a reduction of contractions. Logical? Yeah. Again, people said he's a wacko guy here. We had to correlate that, or we wanted to correlate that with melatonin levels, since that's the link between the light, the clock, and contractions. And so we measured hourly melatonin. And this shows the treated in blue and the untreated women, an added, what do you call it, a summation of all the women in the study. The light effect in the blue you can see is an immediate drop, which we predicted. The intensity of light from this phototherapy lamp and the distance at which we applied it was such that we didn't expect complete abolition. We didn't want that, but at least, 30, 40, 50% reduction. Each woman is a little different, I must say, as you'll see in a second. We had predicted that, based on some Japanese work, that the women with the pale eyes, the blue-green-eyed women, might be more sensitive to light and hence have a more dramatic suppression in melatonin than the dark-eyed. Well, most of our women were African American, and so we had mostly dark eyes. The few pale-eyed women, we saw no greater sensitivity. So we really can't say that's a connection there. So this was the melatonin work. What did we see for contractions? Now, I can't show you all 20 women, but I was blown away. I remember the first study on that night. We did one woman after the other over the course of a year. That first study was on my birthday. And I was in the room, getting things set up and, answering questions that the woman had. And we stepped out. The light went on, and an hour later, I came back in. And this first woman, as you see on the top left, she had stopped contracting. I wasn't expecting that. I expected something, but not that. And it happened again, and again, and again. I mean, many of the women showed only a partial suppression of contractions, as you see on the top right and the bottom right. But many showed complete suppression, and not just for the hour the light was on, because it went off after an hour, but there was a refractoriness, a delay and an inertia for 1, 2, even 3 hours before the contractions came back up again, as you see on the graph here. This just really threw me away. I thought, wow, have we discovered something here or not? Well, we published this work, and again, it was ignored. This is a summary of what we had done up to that point. We'd already shown melatonin receptors are expressed. What I didn't show you is that they're expressed in much higher levels in pregnant women entering labor compared to those who were not in labor. So as I alluded to, the receptors are expressed at the time of labor. And then finally, the light exposure to suppress melatonin resulted in a significant, or in some cases, complete cessation of uterine contractions. Okay, so what? Well, I propose using light as a tocolytic drug, if you will, suppressing preterm uterine contractions. Now, it's not going to work for everyone. As you can see, there are differences from woman to woman. What we've done since the initial light work is to try and refine the wavelength of light, because the phototherapy lamp is a full optical spectrum of light from blue to red. And data shown at the bottom here colorfully indicates that the most effective wavelength for suppressing melatonin is blue light. Well, isn't that interesting? We evolved in a world where blue light is our sky. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? In fact, that works for all organisms to suppress melatonin. Those cells I mentioned, the intrinsically photoreceptive retinal cells, have a special pigment which peaks at 470 nanometer wavelengths. So we're proposing to use blue light to suppress melatonin and hence contractions. What's nice about this, it penetrates the closed eyelids, has very few side effects. The one that I always get feedback on is circadian disruption. Everyone knows about blue light effects and so on. Well, our studies so far are using light exposure at 2 different times during the night. Without getting into details again here, in terms of clock function, if you give light in the early evening, you delay it, kind of like jet lag. Yeah? If you give light in the early morning hours, late night, you advance it. Again, it's kind of like going westward or eastward, right? When the light happens. Well, in our studies here, we're giving 2 time points, one to delay it and one to advance it. So we're going back 1 and forward 1, right back to where we started. We haven't shifted the clock at all. So that's our model. It's a convenient treatment. We use a comfortable sleep mask like you see people in airplanes wearing all night, you know. It has small blue light emitting devices in it. It's not a burst of light. It's a gradual ramping up over 5 minutes, and then it stays on for an hour like our previous studies and then ramps back down again. So it doesn't wake the people during the night. It's very low cost. This is a really important thing, I believe. I mean, these masks should be available for under $200. Tocolytics will run thousands. So it's an advance if it works. The first steps towards this were to determine if blue light would also work in suppressing contractions. And as you see on the left, we have the red light, which doesn't have effects on the clock, where you have melatonin on the first square there rising in red during the night. Contractions also rising. The second column is shown in green because the light source used, this is a study we published with the group at Harvard. They used 507 nanometers, which is closer to green. It's still blue, but it's blue-green, so they colored the graph green, but it's blue-green. And again, when you turn that light on at night, you suppress melatonin. You see it's flat during that green phase, and the contractions also. So it looks like the principle is sound, that we can suppress contractions using blue light, which goes through the closed eyelids, and by suppressing melatonin, reducing contractions. Now, we haven't done this in preterm labor because how do you know you're going to go into preterm labor? There is some familial relationship. You can predict that if you've had a risk of preterm, you're likely to have it again. It's not guaranteed, but it's a risk. There are groups now that have published blood tests, which are very reliable. Seroprognostics in Utah has this nice study where they can predict up to 90% of the women assessed at week 20 that their risk of preterm is high thereafter. They can't say at week 24 or 25 or 26, but it's high risk. So we're trying to work with them in obtaining a population to study, because otherwise, you know, it's 10% of the population and we want to do a reasonable study, we'd have to recruit 1,000 women. That's just not feasible. Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to provide me the room for that? Yeah. So it's been a challenge for us to do this, but we're on our way. We have partners in crime here. This is the schematic of our mask with the LEDs for the light generation. We also are trying to think a little futuristic here and include other sensors, heart rate sensors, EMG, eye movement sensors, tell us something about their sleep patterns. And this would all be connected through Bluetooth to equipment which would then record for us, and we can do the study very efficiently. We have a group in New York, 10X Beta, developing this mask for us, and our partners are in London, Professor Anna David. She's been really great at helping us to identify some of the challenges in recruiting, and Michael Paitis at the University of Miami. I don't have any more concrete data to say, but I'm very optimistic. Obviously, there are a number of challenges, and FDA is the biggest one, to getting a mask like this on the market, but we're hopeful. Thank you very much. Should I answer a question now or later?
For questions, can we leave them after Carolina? Because then we will be having a discussion right after.
Okay.
So thank you, James.
Sure.
That was incredibly insightful. We'll be moving to our third speaker for today. Carolina Belen Espinoza Sanueza, I hope I pronounced that right, completed her PhD in architecture at Laval University in Quebec. And she's currently seeking a postdoc position. Her doctoral thesis used a biophilic lens to focus on the study of light and color design in interiors for visual performance and circadian stimulation in extreme locations, specifically Arctic communities, developing methods and models to describe and predict emotions that light and color evoke. She brings a sensitive approach to architectural research grounded in perceptual sciences and technology. Since the neurohormones of birth are impacted by light and color, ambience, and atmosphere, this work is valuable for birth environment design, research, and practice. Let us all welcome Carolina.
Is it good? Yeah. Wait, normally it works. Yeah, nice. Super. So, thank you very much. I'm going to present a part of my research, my doctoral research that finished in 2024. The name is Biophilic Light and Color and Well-Being in Far Northlands. I would like to mention right now I'm working in something a little bit different. I'm working in indoor air quality and building performance, also in First Nations and extreme climates. So it's because of that that I have my my affiliation with the Toronto Metropolitan University, but actually all this research was conducted at Laval University in Quebec City. So what are we going to talk today? It's about how biophilic design, and then I will explain what is biophilic design. So first of all, what is biophilic design and how light and color, which are related with biophilic design, can foster well-being in extreme built environments, including Arctic regions. We will discuss about what is the physiological impact of light and color in indoors. And also we will discuss about the attributes of light and color. So this means the way that we can describe colors and the way that we can talk about how these descriptions can help us to predict potential impacts of